let's suppose you were President of the United States, and you had a diplomatic matter of some consequence to have resolved. Who would be the one diplomat you would pick to do that? Would it be Henry Kissinger, Jim Baker, George Shultz, somebody else?
There are a lot of, again, I interviewed 130 officials, some great diplomats, some great generals. I have a whole section of my book on the use of war as a diplomatic instrument. But it would clearly be Kissinger, David. And the reason I say that is that he had a breadth of knowledge. He had a capacity to fit pieces together. He had a negotiating style, and he mentioned that his negotiating style was to always say what his goal was and what the goal of the negotiation should be. He had a capacity to put himself in the other's shoes. Let me give you an example. After the 73 Yom Kippur War, the Israelis, who were flat on their back, and Nixon and Kissinger deserve great credit for rearming them, had then turned the war around, and they had Egypt on the run. They had encircled the Third Army and could have crushed the heart of Sadat's army. What did Kissinger do? And this shows his brilliance as a negotiator and his ability to look beyond the immediate moment. He convinced Golda, and it was not easy, not to exterminate the Third Army. And the reason was, he said to her, if we humiliate Sadat by terminating their army, you'll never get peace with Egypt. Look, Golda, beyond the immediate military victory to what your real goal is, which is peace with Egypt. We won't achieve it if you annihilate them. And he had that great capacity to look beyond the moment and to convince people. And he would go between Sadat, between Begin, between Golda Meir, and really understand what each needed.
Okay.
So without question, he did. And let me just mention on China, he did not know hardly anything about China, except that he wanted to separate them from the Soviet Union. He was a European expert. That's what he taught at Harvard. He talked about the balance of power going back to, the Vienna Convention. But he studied Chinese history. He studied its culture. And he told me something very interesting. He said, when you negotiate with the Soviets, they have an agenda. They don't deviate from the agenda. They go right through the agenda. With Zhou Enlao, I didn't have an agenda. And I wanted to get right to the point. And then I realized, I said, wait a minute, that's not the way they negotiate. Zhou Enlao wanted to show him around the Forbidden City. He wanted to talk about Chinese culture and Chinese history. And Kissinger understood that you have to negotiate with different countries in different ways.
So, talking about that for a moment, whose idea was it to open to China, the Western world? Was that Nixon's? Was it Kissinger's? What was the nature of the rivalry? And how did Kissinger sneak into China, negotiate a pre-Nixon visit without the world knowing about it?
So Nixon and Kissinger came to this separately at almost the same time. Let's remember, and this is what's remarkable about the confidence that Nixon had in him and appointed him as his national security advisor initially. He was Nelson Rockefeller's advisor in the quite bitter primary between Rockefeller and Nixon. And he had written for Rockefeller a piece talking about the need to open to China. At the same time, Nixon in 1967 had written a piece in Foreign Affairs saying we need to open to China. Why? For two reasons. First, we couldn't isolate a country with 1 billion people. And second, and Nixon fit this into a Cold War context, we're in the middle of the Cold War, we need to find a way to separate the two communist giants, to get in between them. Now, unfortunately, we're in a situation where we sort of push them both into each other's arms. So they both came to that. Now, on your second point, Kissinger was so well known at the time, he tried every means possible, including at cocktail parties with third parties, to go up to an ambassador and say, the U.S. would really like to talk to you guys. It took him a year. In the end, the way he snuck in to China was through Pakistan and using the plane of the Pakistani president.
Right. So for the last 10, 20 years or so, or 30 years, we've said the opening to China was a great thing for the United States and for the world. But looking at it selfishly as Americans, would we be better off if China had not emerged into the Western world? They were poor, they didn't have a lot of weapons to threaten us, they weren't economic or technological rivals. Are we as Americans better off for the Chinese being where they are today, or would you be better off if Nixon and Kissinger just went about their business and didn't open China?
No, the answer is no. They would have risen in any event. Better to have as many ties with them as possible. And let me give you a humorous anecdote. David, again, was part of this. So Nixon and Kissinger opened to China, but they didn't normalize. They didn't establish formal diplomatic relations because there was a very powerful Taiwan lobby in the Republican Party that was opposed to it. We did that in the Carter administration. We actually normalized relations. And here's the anecdote. We're in the cabinet room, and Deng Xiaoping comes in. He's 4'11", and my first notion was to say, how does a little guy like this control 1 billion Chinese? So he sits at the cabinet table, and he thanks the president for this historic opening, the first time since the end of World War II that we're establishing diplomatic relations. And he says to the president, Mr. President, I really appreciate this, but what we really need now is to build our economy up. And in order to do that, we need what's called most favored nation treatment, namely that you would lower your tariffs on Chinese goods to those you give to your closest allies. And he says, I know that there's a problem with doing that because of the so-called Jackson-Vanik Amendment after Henry Jackson and Charlie Vanik. But that was aimed at the Soviet Union, and it's said that the Soviets couldn't get that favorable treatment because they restricted the emigration of Soviet Jews. And he says to Carter, we don't restrict the number of Chinese. And he pushes a little piece of paper over with the White House, Washington, and a pencil over to Carter, and he says, write on here the number of Chinese you'd like us to send you each year, 1 million, 10 million, 20 million? And Carter laughs and says, I'll tell you what, we'll make a deal right now. I will take 10 billion Chinese a year if you'll take 10,000 American journalists. But the point is that it would have been a huge mistake not to do so. And look, there's no question, but the current president of China, Xi Jinping, is a very tough guy. He's aggressive. The Belt and Road Initiative, the buildup of their military, the militarization of the South China Sea, cyber warfare. He's a very tough guy. But if we treat China purely as an enemy, they will be an enemy. We need to find ways on climate change, on pandemics, and on the economy, where we work together. I mean, your firm has investments in Chinese companies. We need to create the kind of economic linkage. We have a $500 million trade relationship with China. That's important to China. We have invested $120 billion a year of American companies in China. So we need to keep that kind of linkage because the bilateral relationship between the US and China will be the most important in the 21st century, diplomatically, politically, militarily.